Good morning and welcome to our community affairs program that we call 30 Minutes. Today we will hear from Raphe Whaley as he speaks of local Civil War and other history in and around Obion County. Whaley is a longtime police officer with the Union City Police Department and school resource officer. He holds a history degree from the University of Tennessee, Martin. Again, our special guest this week is Mr. Raphe Whaley.
I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. I guess I'm going to end the distinguished speaker part of... I've never spoken to Rotary before. Every time I've ever spoken, typically it's on law enforcement issues or juvenile justice issues. So I don't consider myself an expert on the American Civil War. I have probably 2,500 books on the subject. I've read just about every one of them, but I'm not an expert. I don't ever want to be an expert on American history because that means there's nothing else to learn. And in this area, there is so much for us to learn about and to see. And the problem here, and I know as well as anybody, you're talking about money issues. We don't have a lot of historic markers in this county, and I'm not going to talk about that today, but if you go into Kentucky, just about on every road, whether it's a county highway or whatever, there are historic markers everywhere. There are some significant things that occurred here that have been forgotten to time. At the start of the American Civil War in Obion County, the population was approximately 12,800, 2,400 of which were African Americans. Only 38 of those were free. Over 1 million pounds of tobacco were produced in 1861 in Obion County. You tell a lot of people that, and they can't believe it because they don't ever see tobacco being grown here. There were a lot of issues, of course, a myriad of issues surrounding the war, and I don't get political. I don't talk politics. I think the consensus today is becoming stronger and stronger about the central issue. But I don't talk politics. I don't talk modern politics. I don't talk past politics. I don't like doing that. You will never know if I'm a Democrat or a Republican because I was raised in a home that was, I would say, fairly conservative, but my father was very independent. He was Jackie Whaley from Hornbeak. Most of you probably don't know him. He died in 1997. He did work here in Union City as a supervisor with a telephone company for several years. But I think that's where I got my passion for history. I remember when I was about 10 years old, we went to Shiloh National Military Park. And I was just enamored with all of the plaques and the statues and the monuments and the museum. And I also remember a great influence of mine was a man named Bob Chambers. He had served in the Pacific in World War II as a surveyor from Hornbeak. And I can remember him telling me about a lot of the actions that took place during World War II. And he told me several stories. He said, you hear about atrocities in Vietnam and places like that. He said, we used to, a lot of captured Japanese, he said they would come onto the ship. And he said, what do you think we would do with them? I said, I don't know, you'd send them off to POW camps. He said, never. He said, we would line them up on the bow of the ship and we'd mow them down and they'd fall into the ocean. So that, all these kinds of stories to me just fascinated me. And there's so much history in this town that is either, I won't say undeveloped, it's underdeveloped. When you drive north on First Street, a lot of you know this, I see a lot of history buffs in here. When you drive north on First Street, of course, when you go up to where the old Brown Shoe Company was, if you look off to the right, if you're headed north, at one time in 1861, there were 13,000 soldiers camped there. Some of you probably knew that. It was called Camp Brown. At the start of the war, of course, Obion County was predominantly secessionist. The vote in the county was, I think, 2,200 to 38 in favor of secession. So to say that it was completely pro-Confederate is not true. There were several Union sympathizers. The farther north you went, Tennessee, of course, when you got on the border states, Kentucky, so on and so forth, you found a lot of pro-Union sentiment. When you go farther south, like in the Mississippi and places like that, you didn't find a lot of pro-federal government sentiment. Some of the significant things that occurred here during the war, there were 4 battles that occurred in Union City, and I won't go into those. There were two what are considered Class B minor battles. Both of which Nathan Bedford Forrest took place in, sort of. The second one he did not. In 1864, as he was making what is called the Second West Tennessee Raid, he came into Union City. His objective was Paducah. There was a fort in Paducah called Fort Anderson. Some of you may be aware of that. He left and took a detachment on to Paducah, and he left a man named Colonel William Duckworth, who was from Brownsville, in charge of what little Confederate force he had here. Duckworth was outnumbered. So in order to gain the surrender of the little Federal detachment that was here, he painted some logs black. And he paraded them around way out in front of the Union forces to make them think that they had cannon or artillery. And he sent a note, that's true, he sent a note and said, "I demand your immediate surrender," and he signed Nathan Bedford Forrest. Well, Forrest had such a reputation, such a horrible, scary reputation that Isaac Hawkins, who was a native Tennessean, he was from Huntington, in fact, he's buried there. He immediately surrendered. In fact, he has the distinction of surrendering Union City twice. There's a lot of history here. Not all of it's Civil War. We have in Northwest Tennessee, we have a lot of individuals that either grew up here or ended their lives here that are very notable. In Eastview Cemetery, we have anybody ever read the book Company H? You probably have. Sam R. Watkins. I know John has. It's probably the most famous memoir by a Confederate written during the Civil War. Sam Watkins was from Columbia. He was a member of the Maury Grays, Maury County Grays. This book is it's very entertaining. It's slightly embellished. It's considered the greatest work of nonfiction by a Confederate or a memoir. He talks about a colonel in there that he compares to Stonewall Jackson. Hume, Humer Field. Hume Field was from Maury County and was elected as the colonel of this regiment. He ended up living in Union City after the war, and he died here of a brain hemorrhage in 1921, I think. That may not be right. He is buried in Eastview Cemetery. Now, to most people, I know Mr. Miller is about to go to sleep, because every time I start talking about history, he dozes off just like that. To most people, that's not very interesting. To me, it's fascinating. There's just a lot of really, really good history here. A lot of the history of the wars, to me, a couple of incidents that occurred here that are very fascinating, that have been forgotten to time. In 1867, we had an assassination here. Any of you aware of that? A state senator was murdered in Obion County, Almon Case. He was a Yankee, as somebody referred to Northerners earlier, who had moved here in 1847 from Ohio. He actually lived, if you leave Hornbeak right now and you go to Glass, everybody know what I'm talking about? When you go to the Glass community, like you're going to go to Obion, he lived in that area, and he was assassinated there by an individual named Frank Ferris. And this was because of the Civil War. Ferris's brother had been tortured during the war, and he thought that Almon Case, who was a physician, was responsible. And they were friends in all actuality. And one afternoon, as you leave Hornbeak, probably about, I would say, 2 miles from the ballpark, if you're going toward Glass, right there on the road, supposedly, that great historian Raphe Whaley told me this. This is where the assassination occurred. This made the New York Times. It made all the southern newspapers. This was a big deal, but it's forgotten to history. Now, to most people, that doesn't merit a historical marker. To somebody like me, it does. Of course, you're talking about a lot of money. You're talking about a lot of time. The state legislature has to approve that. I know several years ago, Darvin Ousley, I don't know if you know him or not, he used to be the computer maintenance guy for the county school system. He and I are really good friends. We went to Waverly, and we went to a site where Jesse James lived at one time in Humphreys County. Of course, Jesse James, I don't have to talk about who that is. He's probably one of the most notorious criminals in American history. He lived there after the Northfield, Minnesota raid. I don't know if you know, I won't go into detail about that. That would take an hour to talk about. He and his brother Frank lived in Tennessee for a few years after that raid. And they lived on this farm in Humphreys County, and his wife had stillborn twins. And when Darby and I went there, they were still buried there. You could still see the stones. There was no marker. There was nothing. So we contacted Philip Pinion. And within a couple of years, there was a historical marker put up. I know it's a lot of effort, and there's a lot of work that goes into that, but it's to me, it's something that's very important. I know now that with Discovery Park, I told everybody before it was ever built, I'd seen the blueprints. I said, this is going to be massive. It's going to be a big deal for this area. And I actually had friends who said, no, it's not. Well, I've been proven right, which is rare. It's huge. And as far as American history goes, this is a world-class museum right here in this area, no doubt about it. It covers the Civil War, a lot of military history really well. As a native Obion Countyan, I love to promote history in this area. I love to talk about it a lot. There is a lot of Civil War history here, but there's not just Civil War history. We have several people who are receiving Revolutionary War pensions who are buried in this county. The sword master for Andrew Jackson at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend is buried on Catherine Roberts' farm out off of State Line Road, I believe. In fact, I took part in a reenactment there to place a marker. Major John B. Jones, he was buried in their garden. And I'm trying to remember who came over from the university. Somebody came over from the university and found where his body was in the garden. And we had the 7th Living Infantry Regiment come up and do a reenactment. Were any of you there? I don't know if you were out there. That's been about 6 or 7 years ago, and I think the paper came out and took pictures, and it was a really neat deal. There was a pretty good crowd there, and they put a marker in their garden, so if you see her or any of their family, you can talk to them. I'm trying to think of, I think I've got dementia. Candy who? Moore, that's right. She had a letter. She had an actual letter President Madison had written to Major John B. Jones. And it was kind of a keepsake, but when Darby and I saw it, we just flipped out. We said, you've got to do something with this. I think she's moved off. I'm not sure. I don't know if she ever did or not, but stuff like that to me is just incredible. My wife and a lot of people I know could care less. I remember one time we were at Chickamauga. Of course, if you've ever been to Chickamauga battlefield, it's about like Shiloh. Shiloh's 4,400 acres, and Chickamauga's probably a little bit bigger. And I pull over, and she's over there just like that. And I go running off into the woods, and I look over, and there's a marker, and it says, General John Bell Hood was shot astride his horse at this spot. I just stopped. I go running back, and I shake her, and she looks over, she goes, what? I said, I just saw where John Bell Hood was shot. Now, for any of you who know who John Bell Hood is, anybody know who John Bell Hood is? He probably killed the Army of Tennessee. You might want to look that up. The battles of Franklin and Nashville. He was wounded at Gettysburg in his left arm, and he kept it, but it was like a toothpick the rest of his life. It just sort of hung there. 3 months later, after recuperating, he is sent to the West to fight for the Confederacy in the West. Bad luck. He's sitting astride his horse, and a sharpshooter hits him in his right leg, and they take his leg off just below the hip. To me, this was fascinating. This was incredible. And sometimes when I get to talking about history, I have a great passion for it. But I have a great passion for history. There's a lot of Civil War history here. To go into detail about it would be crazy. Probably the two most famous battles fought in Union City were, the first one was in December of '62. The second one was probably the second biggest one was in April of '64 on Forrest's second raid into West Tennessee. But there is a lot of history here. There's a lot of older homes. One subject I like to talk about has nothing to do with Civil War history that I don't believe is promoted enough. Actually, is General Clifton B. Cates, I've actually thought about writing an article about him and trying to get it published. He retired as the commandant of the Marine Corps. He led one of the three-pronged attack at Iwo Jima when he's from Tiptonville. He was born in Tiptonville, went to junior high in Tiptonville. He left and went to an academy for young boys in Missouri. Went from Missouri. Anybody ever heard his name? I know you've seen markers, highway markers. He left and went to the University of Tennessee on I believe a baseball scholarship. I'm not sure. Then went into the Marine Corps. And when you retire as a commandant of the Marine Corps, you're a 4-star general. You have to be. And he's buried at Arlington. So you don't see, other than, Cates Landing, of course, is named after him. And the reason it's named, that area is named, because that was where he was born and raised. That's about it. The last thing I'd like to say is, anytime you get a chance to explore local history, please do so. Discovery Park has a lot of local history. A lot of living veterans are interviewed. I know you've all been out there and seen that. It's wonderful. I think this is such a great promotion for this area. I teach classes at the middle school, which are juvenile behavioral classes, but I always throw in history, and I always promote Discovery Park because I think it's one of the best things we've done that has ever been done in this area, particularly for the promotion of history. I know it requires a lot of money, but I would really like to see a lot more markers in this area. And you guys are the leaders here. You're the leaders of this community, and I appreciate you. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I really do.
Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, I hear that a bunch.
Well, Lake County, of course, was part of Obion County in 1862. Island number 10 has been largely overlooked. There was a book written by Larry J. Daniel, which is really good, called Island number 10, The Battle of Island number 10. Daniel is a Methodist minister right now in Lexington. He's written some really good, really big, well-known Civil War books. He wrote a really good book on Shiloh. Island number 10 at the time was called Island number 10 because it was the 10th island south of the confluence of the rivers. And there was a large Confederate garrison there of over 5,000 troops, a lot of artillery. Of course, the reasoning behind that was to keep Union gunboats from coming down the river. It is not forgotten, but it's overlooked mostly in history because it was the final battle was fought of the first day of the Battle of Shiloh, which at that time, when Shiloh was fought, April 6th and 7th, 1862, there were almost 24,000 casualties at Shiloh. And that was early in the war. And that, at that time, that 2-day battle, literally, that was greater than all of the American casualties in all wars since the Revolution. So Island number 10 is pretty much overshadowed. If you get a chance to go down, if you go down to if you're traveling into Tiptonville, I believe it's the second stoplight, maybe, you take a right, you go all the way out to the river, you go probably 10 miles. You'll come to the stop. I believe there's a Y or a T, I don't know. And there's a marker right in front of you. And if you'll go up on that bluff, you can see what's left of Island number 10. Of course, now it's part of the Missouri shoreline because of the change of the river over the years. But it was a very famous battle at the time. Famous Union general fought in that battle, General John Pope. He ended up coming into Tiptonville, capturing Tiptonville. In fact, on that same road, there's an old church on the left with a historic marker there about where a lot of, I believe some of the casualties were buried there.
When you're dealing with young people and inspiring them about history, what's your approach? How do you get them to see the
It's hard to, being a history geek like I am, it's hard to imbue the passion that I have. I usually try to tell a story. I don't like to just give a sequence of events, which pretty much is what I did today. C.S. Lewis said the difference between a sequence of events and a story is a sequence of events would be like if you said the king died and the queen died. But a story is like if you told it from the approach of the king died and the queen died of sorrow. And I know that's pretty lame to say that, but to me that's profound because my father and like the guy I was talking about, Bob Chambers, and the best teachers to me have always been storytellers. They've not just been people who got up and gave dates and names and so on. That's boring. That's very boring, just like what I did today. But people, the best storytellers are people who can hold your attention, and they don't give you a lot of dates, but they're able to get you involved in the history. And usually the best way to learn history is to go to where these things occur. Go to battlefields, go to historic homes. As creepy as it sounds, I told some students the other day, go to cemeteries. A lot of history in cemeteries. Lots of history. Here in Obion County, a lot of old cemeteries here.
The significance of Fort Pillow.
The significance of Fort Pillow, that's a very controversial subject in and of itself. Congressional testimony after the war, Nathan Bedford Forrest traveled to Washington to testify about this. He was never found culpable of any sort of ordering of a massacre. If you don't know anything about Fort Pillow, it's when you go to Henning on 51, if you take a right instead of taking a left, if you're traveling south, you'll go about 17 miles and you'll come to Fort Pillow. Fort Pillow was built at the start of the war. It was named for Gideon Johnson Pillow, who was a Tennessean, had been a very famous Mexican War veteran. He was a political hack. He absolutely was one of the worst generals in American history. He fought for the Confederacy. He had kissed up to General Polk during the Mexican War, and that's how he became as famous as he was. At the start of the war, he was actually military commander of all Tennessee forces at the start of the war. And this fort was built there in his honor. And it was another fort that was built as a river defense. The battle occurred in 1864 in April. And there were probably 300 what they called colored troops at the time that were stationed there. It was the Union forces had taken that fort over. And there's a ton of controversy that I won't go into. There are reports from Union soldiers who say that as the fort surrendered, many of Forrest's troops massacred a lot of these black soldiers. The majority of the soldiers that supposedly were massacred were what they call homegrown Yankees. They were native West Tennesseans who were fighting for the Union. There's a really good book that was just published a few months ago that I read. It's called The River Was Dyed with Blood by Brian Wills. Brian Steele Wills is his name. I think he's a professor at University of Virginia. And he addresses the controversy by not addressing it, basically. He's pretty objective about it. The end result is that Forrest was seen to have not ordered any massacre if there was one that even occurred. There are varying reports. I mean, you have to, that's the best thing about history. History is interpretive, and it changes all the time because as new facts are found out and new accounts and primary sources, diaries, journals, letters are being found from, you get all sorts of new information. History is not static. I mean, it changes constantly. I doubt that answered your question.
You reported enough emphasis on early American history in our schools.
I can't address that. These two individuals probably can. And I'm not trying to defer, but I can't. I was given one time an opportunity at the middle school for a couple of weeks, I think, to teach Civil War history, and I did. And I hope I did a really good job. I doubt that I did, but I hope that I did because I didn't use worksheets and we didn't work out of a book. I talked a lot. I used a lot of audio-visual because I don't know if you realize this or not, but this generation is completely audio-visual. I mean, they are like that all the time. They're literally, you can take, I'll never forget about a year ago, I pull up. Okay, I pull up in my driveway, and my daughter is standing there holding her. I'm not going to look at anything. Standing there holding her cell phone. Tears are pouring down her cheek, and I thought, before I even got out of my car, I thought my mother died, or, you know, another boyfriend broke up with her or whatever. So she's standing there. I said, "What's wrong?" She goes, "I don't have any service." So, you know, these kids are like, literally, I'm not kidding. And it's our fault. Because we give them all this stuff, Xboxes and cell phones and stuff like that. And I'm about to go off on another tangent because I hate cell phones. I hate them. I think that they're wonderful for emergencies, but I mean, and our kids, we're killing our kids with all this technology, and I'm as guilty as anybody. I try to limit their time, but I know that they can tell you better than anybody. I mean, they have to fight the cell phone battle every hour. They get cell phones brought up constantly. And they have parents who act like, you know, you're trying to take a kidney from these kids or something. They'll say, they've got to have their cell phone back. And
Raphe, what was the significance of the Gibbs community during the war?
George Washington Gibbs is credited basically as the founder of this area, the one of the first patriarchs, one of the founding people of Obion County, which was established in 1823, I believe. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know. There is so much local history that I don't know about. Dr. John Marshall wrote a book in 1941, which is considered one of the best histories of Obion County. Rebel Forrester wrote a book called Glory and Tears, which is full of really good information. It's very slanted. I'll just go ahead and tell you, it's very slanted to one. It talks about the last thing I forgot to talk about, train robbery. I have dementia. I won't go into that. We had a very famous train robbery here in 1871, some related to the Civil War, believe it or not. It was 6 years after the war. It made national headlines. If you go up to where the park is, by the police department now, it occurred in that area. There were some pretty famous hotels, big hotels, right off from over the other side of the tracks. The Farrington gang, a couple of brothers, Frank and Alvin Farrington, robbed a train there. And the first recording of a Union City police officer, Officer Klein, was killed. Actually, after the robbery, a few weeks after the robbery, they were brought back in on a train. They were captured by the son of the founder of the Pinkerton Detective Agency. Anybody ever heard of that? Alan Pinkerton was the founder. He sent his son William here to Union City. And the whole time this was going on, the New York Times and a lot of leading newspapers in the country were reporting on this. They captured 3 of these individuals, brought them back in Union City, and as they were coming back in, there was an attempt to rescue these criminals, and an individual shot into the stomach of a police officer and killed him. But I'm sorry, I apologize. I'm not going to go into all that. I'm way over. But there's just a ton. I called Ken Morris one time and I said, "Can we get a marker in the park?" And he said, "Sure, get me some information." So I gave him a lot of information. And Ken is busy. He's very busy. And it's just a lot of money involved there. So we don't have a marker for that. We don't have a marker for a lot of things here. A lot of things that we need markers for. Trenton does a Civil War driving tour, which is pretty good. I mean, the Battle of Trenton was fairly significant. It was in the same 1st Tennessee raid. And I would like to do that here. I thought about getting with John and a few more people who are Civil War buffs and trying to develop a little driving tour, make up some brochures to put at City Hall, but maybe that'll be in the future. Anybody else? Thank you.
Thank you.
And that concludes this week's 30 Minutes program. We hope you enjoyed today's show. And, of course, we invite you to tune in again next week at this same time as we bring you topics and information of importance to our community. From all of us here at Thunderbolt Broadcasting, until we meet again next week, I'm Charles Choate.
You've been listening to 30 Minutes, a community affairs program on Thunderbolt Radio. You can listen to this broadcast and others anytime by visiting thunderboltradio.com and following the Thunderbolt Radio and Digital YouTube page. Thanks for listening.